Welcome to another episode of Living Justice, Living Leadership. I'm your host, Lee Fisher, Dean of Cleveland Marshall College of Law at Cleveland State University. You know, I've had the great privilege to live my life at the intersection of the public, private, nonprofit, and academic worlds. As a lawyer, CEO of 2 nonprofit organizations, and as a state legislator, attorney general, and lieutenant governor. And the lessons I've learned come down to just 2 words: justice and leadership. That's why every week we'll talk to people who are walking the walk. Some are lawyers and some are not, but all of them have something in common. They are change makers. They are guardians of justice. They are living justice, and they are living leadership. Well, I couldn't be more pleased that today's guests are 2 people I've known for a long time, Jim and Nancy Petro. And I think this podcast is especially important today because we're interviewing a couple. And frankly, we don't do that enough because I've never interviewed a guest that doesn't have a significant other that has been equally important in their success. And it says a lot about Jim and Nancy Petro that they wanted to do this together because they have been partners for a long time, not just partners in love as husband and wife, but partners in almost everything they've done, and you'll hear about that today. And I think the best example of that is that they wrote a book together. It's a very important book. It's called False Justice: 8 Myths That Can Convict the Innocent, published by Kaplan in 2011. And that's one of the things we'll be talking about in the podcast today. That book, you should know, received a Constitutional Commentary Award from the Constitutional Project in 2011. And the Northern California Innocence Project's Media Award in 2012. Nancy has co-authored textbook chapters and academic papers and has written blog posts and newspaper commentaries on the topic. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background about both of them. I'm going to guess, but we'll find out today, that they might have met at Denison because I noticed in both their bios they went to Denison. Now, I don't want to embarrass Jim, but only one of them was a Phi Beta Kappa graduate. At least according to the bios. There's no mention of Jim being a Phi Beta Kappa graduate, but there is a mention of Nancy. So we know which one did a little better in college, okay? Jim will have a chance to recover if I'm wrong about that, but I thought I'd mention that at the outset. Nancy retired from a business career in 2008 to focus on writing and advocacy relating to wrongful criminal convictions. Now, I will say I know Jim better because Jim and I served together in public office for many years, and he's got a very, very distinguished career in public service. The most recent being that he was the chancellor of the University System of Ohio, and we'll hear more about that in the podcast. Jim and I first met when he was a state representative. Later, he became a Cuyahoga County commissioner. And then he was a state auditor and attorney general. So one thing Jim and I have in common, and there are not too many of us, is we've held 2 statewide offices. His, of course, was auditor and attorney general, but I think Jim would probably agree that the most important office in state government is attorney general. And we both held that one. And I can't wait to hear about his perspective on holding that office. Jim was the first state attorney general to intervene on behalf of an Innocence Project client, and later became a pro bono lawyer for the Ohio Innocence Project. And he worked for the Ohio Innocence Project on the Ohio Criminal Justice Reform Law that was enacted in 2010. And he received the 2010 Innocence Network Champion of Justice Award. So, welcome, Jim and Nancy Petro.
Thank you, Lee. Good to be with you.
Well, thank you both. You know, I always like to begin these interviews on a more personal level, talking about your life and raising your children. So let's begin with how you met. And am I right? Did I guess right that you met at Denison?
We did, and we were good friends at Denison, but we weren't necessarily college sweethearts at Denison.
Huh.
It was a circumstance where we bumped into each other. Not unlike your career, I had summertime, after my first year at Case Law, where you also went.
Yes.
And after that year, I went and spent the summer on Capitol Hill working for Senator Bill Saxby. While I was there, I ran into a group of Denison friends. I mean, that small college, you went to Oberlin, so you understand how all that comes together.
Yes.
Um, ran into all these people. And one day, one of them said, well, you know Nancy Petro, she lives in Annapolis. Well, I was able to find her phone number because I had always had a bit of a crush on her. And we were simply friends in college. But I did track her down in Annapolis, made arrangements. She immediately welcomed me to come for a visit. She said she'd make dinner, which was a good deal.
That's a good sign. That's a very good sign.
So on a Sunday,
Because if she didn't like you, by the way, she would have said, let's meet for lunch.
that's right, and I can buy. But in this case, it was a wonderful day, and a friendship was rekindled. We'd been friends in college, maybe had a couple of dates, but not any long-term romantic thing, but good friends. And I think it's not unfair to say I always had a bit of a secret crush on her. But I might have had a different girlfriend. She had a different boyfriend. It never meshed until a point after college when we bumped into each other in the greater Washington area.
So the magic was that night at dinner that Nancy made. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, the ham loaf and mustard sauce is recommended.
Ham loaf and mustard sauce.
I was
With all due respect, that doesn't sound very romantic, but I'll take your word for it. Okay.
the kind of eating I was doing, working on Capitol Hill and grabbing this or that. It was a feast.
Ham loaf and mustard sauce. I'm going to try that. There's probably obviously something romantic about it that I don't see. So I'll talk about Peggy about that this evening. Okay.
Convinced when it was over that I had to see more of her, if not because she was extraordinarily good looking, but because she was a good cook.
Uh-huh. So Nancy, did you have a secret crush on Jim, or did your crush come much later?
I'll just say when I left Denison, I thought, boy, we ran into each other. The last person I saw as we left for the last time was Jim Petro.
Wow.
We were both dropping our books off at the student union, and we chatted for a few minutes. And when I walked away, I thought, boy, I should have really gotten to know him a little bit.
Wow, isn't that great? I love that. So there actually was a secret crush there.
Yeah,
There was.
yes, there was.
Okay.
And I'd always had a bit of a crush on her. At the time, I was pinned to another girl.
Okay.
So,
And that gets in the way.
that gets in.
That does get in the way. I agree. So how long did you date before you got married?
I should point out, and you'll appreciate this, I'm in case law. She accepted a job in the greater Cleveland area, even after we visited me in Washington, D.C., she in Annapolis, Maryland. And she accepted a job there. And we kind of stayed in touch. And I helped her find an apartment on Overlook above Case Western Reserve.
Yes, of course.
And so I helped her move in. We were friends. That was it.
So what is it, about a year later?
We got married. We got married a year later. Yeah. So I didn't drag my feet.
Okay. Jim, did you know, even while you were at Denison or law school, that you were likely to have a career in politics? Because you come from a family that has some political background.
Mm-hmm.
Well, even in 1968, I was going into my third year at Denison, but for that summer and much of the fall, I was kind of a field guy for Bill Saxby, who ultimately got elected to the U.S. Senate that year.
Yes.
I think you might have been working for the other guy.
I was, but I know Bill Saxby was a state attorney general, a U.S. attorney general, a U.S. senator, quite a career.
Quite a career, and really a neat guy to work for. I had a lot of fun with him. He gave me a great opportunity on Capitol Hill. So I owe a lot to Bill Saxby. And I came to really enjoy the whole idea of politics through Bill Saxby.
Nancy, did you have any qualms about marrying somebody who was likely to get into politics?
No, none at all. I just felt public service would be a very interesting livelihood, a career. And so I encouraged him. It wouldn't have been for me personally, but I thought he was perfect for that role.
I like the fact that you answered my question by not using the word politics and saying public service. because those of us who have been in politics prefer to refer to it as public service. Because even though it is politics, politics has a negative connotation. Public service has a more positive connotation. And the truth is that it really is both. It's public service and politics. They're really enmeshed, but I think that the public doesn't really understand that as well. To be a good public servant, you have to be a good politician, and vice versa.
Yeah, and I think some people actually get into it because they really love the politics of it. And some people get into it because they really love the service of it. I think you and Jim love the public service aspect of it, and the politics was just something you had to also do.
That's a very good way to put it. That's right. The politics is sort of a means to the end of public service. That's right. That's right. So let's talk a little bit about that. Go ahead, Jim.
I was only going to say, I think it should be noted that you and I started together.
Yes.
Both were elected to the Ohio General Assembly the same year. You a Democrat from the east side of Cleveland, me a Republican from the west side of Cleveland.
Yes,
And,
exactly.
I think we were the two newcomers from Greater Cleveland.
I think you're right. You're right.
Based on that, we both went on the Judiciary Committee. I think we were active in the death penalty.
Yes, that's right. We were.
So, I mean, we have a great deal in common.
And the irony of it is that in recent years, you and I actually have co-authored some op-eds on similar issues where Republicans and Democrats have gotten together. You don't see that too much these days in politics on any level.
Yes, that's true.
And so let's talk a little bit about your first venture into the political arena, and that was the state legislature. Why did you decide to run? Who did you run against, and what was that experience like?
Well, I was already in politics to the extent that the mayor of Rocky River had appointed me as city prosecutor when I was quite young, because we had our first home in Rocky River. He then later, there was an opening in law director, and he said, well, you know, it's elected here, you ought to run. And I said, well, great, Mayor, I will. And he supported me. Nobody ran against me. So I was elected law director of Rocky River. 3 years later, our House seat, just like your House seat in 1980,
yes,
became vacant from the incumbent.
Who was the incumbent up until the time you ran?
Jim Betts announced that he was going to run for U.S. Senate.
I remember,
This
yes.
representative from Western Cuyahoga County.
Yep.
He called me and said, you know, you might want to think, I was the law director of Rocky River, an elected position. And he called me and said, you might want to think about running. I'm not going to run again. Nancy and I talked about it. And within days, I said, well, heck yes, I'd love to be in the legislature. I mean, you know.
Yeah.
So I got into running, same way you did, as Harry was moving on to something else.
Harry Lehman, that's right.
And so you and I both had predecessors stepping aside, and you and I had the opportunity to take advantage of that.
Exactly right. And tell me what the experience was like in the state legislature and how long you were there.
Well, I went there for 2 terms and then decided not to run again. A variety of things happening, kids in school, all those things. So I did 2 terms serving with you. Although you went to the Senate, I think
did.
in 84.
I did. Actually, I went to the Senate after only 2 years in the House. That's right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I did 4 years in the House, and then I didn't run. My successor ran. He was a young man from a very prominent family, and he only chose to serve 1 term. And in that 1 term that he was serving, I started thinking, you know, I missed this, and maybe a more comprehensive political engagement could be good for me. So I took 2 years off, I always say, for good behavior. Came back and ran again in 1986 and was elected again. And then by 1990, I was looking at running statewide. And ran that year in 1990 for Ohio Auditor of State. Did not win, lost to a long-term incumbent.
That was, you ran against Tom Ferguson?
I ran against Tom Ferguson.
Right, okay.
And it was really quite close. It was like 52-48.
Yes.
Nobody's ever come close to Ferguson. So I ran a pretty good campaign, but lost. Yep. It was then that our Republican county commissioner was stepping aside, and I was appointed by the county Republican Party to the county commission seat held by a Republican.
Who was it? Was that Virgil Brown?
Yes.
It was Virgil Brown.
Okay.
And Virgil became at that point head of the Board of Elections.
Okay.
So now, we took Virgil Brown's seat on the county commission, working with Tim Hagan and Mary Boyle. We had a great relationship. I enjoyed being commissioner. I got elected on my own 2 years later for the balance of the term, and then got talked into running statewide again and lost. No, I'm sorry, I won. State auditor. I got elected state auditor, which was a terrific job, by the way. I really enjoyed it. But after 2 terms there, I was excited about running for attorney general.
Okay.
And I got elected to that also. I'm trying to think where you were at that point.
Well, back in 1990, when you ran for state auditor, I was running for state attorney general. So again, our careers were actually quite parallel. We had been in the legislature for most of 1980 to 1990. And then I ran for attorney general, and that was a year when you may recall, I won the closest statewide election in Ohio political history.
It was like a 12-vote margin or something.
Well, actually, it's a margin you'll never forget when I tell you. 1, 2, 3, 4.
That's right.
1,234 votes after a recount and a contest in the Ohio Supreme Court. I used to joke, Jim and Nancy, that I could go anywhere in Ohio, look somebody straight in the eye, and know there was a good chance that person did not vote for me. And then, of course, one of the things I always like to talk about, Jim, is that there are very few people who've been successful in American politics who haven't at least lost one race. And losing is extremely difficult. But it's also one of those necessary rites of passage in some ways. Talk about that loss for state auditor, because you had far more victories in your career than you had defeats. In fact, that was your only defeat, other than, of course, for governor, which we'll talk about later. Am I right?
Yes, that's true. And I ran against Tom Ferguson. He had been auditor of state for 20 years.
A legend.
Yes, and his father before him.
Yes.
So the
Jumping Joe Ferguson.
That's right. The Ferguson family really were legends in state office, specifically the auditor of state. I lost to Tom Ferguson that first time I ran.
Yes.
And then became county commissioner. And then as I'm getting ready to think about statewide, even the state party chairman, Bob Bennett, said, well, next time you always want to run for AG, you should run for AG. I think you were AG at that point. I didn't want to run against you.
Well, that was a wise decision.
That's right. And so I made the decision to run again for auditor of state. Ferguson did not run. The young man, Randy, whose father was on the Ohio Supreme Court.
It's funny because I can't remember either, but I'll figure that out. Yeah.
He ran, but I won. And it was a close, very close race, but I won. And so that was my first, opportunity to serve in state office as a state auditor. And I loved being state auditor. I was reelected handily. I think I did quite a nice job. It kind of really bringing the whole concept of auditing and accounting into play in a very professional way. And I enjoyed the job.
Now, Nancy, you were having a business career at the same time, weren't you not? Were you not?
Yes, I had a business career. Actually, Nancy and I helped operate a family business, a restaurant that we owned.
Okay.
We did a variety of things over the years. She had a business career of her own, and I had an active business career, plus I practiced law.
So during those years when Jim is in public office, he's a state representative, then he's later a county commissioner and a state auditor. What are you doing during those years, Nancy?
Well, first I was having babies,
Okay. How many, by the way?
two.
Those two,
Okay.
And
boy and a girl.
so when he was
Okay.
in the legislature, we had very, very young children. So, and I always had an at-home career, which was a graphic design business that I ran out of the house and marketing. And, I was doing those things and did that for over 20 years, the graphic design business, and then became an entrepreneur and formed a national high school, created a national high school sports magazine that I operated for 5 years before selling it to a Boston-based company.
It
And
was
then
America's largest high school sports magazine.
at the time,
Really? That's amazing.
It was really quite a nice little business.
Yeah.
and then I became involved in technology with sports, capturing high school sports statistics on, at the time, a Palm Pilot. So that was a long time ago.
Yeah.
And then after that, I retired. And that's when I had simultaneously was learning about wrongful conviction for the first time through Jim's work. And
Before we talk about wrongful conviction, I do want to ask you about your two children. What are they doing now?
Our son John is a screenwriter. Most of the time in Hollywood, he's with his family and his wife and children at their father-in-law's home on Cuba Lake, New York.
Mm-hmm.
So they're there for what proves to be many, many weeks. We'll get to see him in about a week. And then he'll go back to Los Angeles. They wanted to get out of there because of the fires. So they've been COVID. So they've been spending a couple of months away from their home in Santa Monica, but he is a screenwriter. Okay. Our daughter is CEO of a healthcare company. She lives in Wellesley, Massachusetts. Her family, she and her spouse have two little boys that are just adorable.
Don't forget, John and his wife Emily have three children who are just adorable.
So you have 5 grandchildren.
Yes.
5 grandchildren.
That is an accomplishment in of itself. That's fantastic.
Yeah,
that's
they're
great.
all good.
We've been listening to Jim and Nancy Petro. Jim served as the Attorney General of Ohio, as State Auditor of Ohio, and we learned how they met. We learned how Jim entered public service. Stay tuned for our next episode, when we're going to hear about the book that they wrote together. It's known as False Justice: 8 Myths That Convict the Innocent. We're going to hear an extraordinary case of Clarence Elkins, how he was wrongfully convicted, and how it led to their spending the next 10 years of their life doing everything they could to expose the fact that there are too many wrongful convictions in America. Stay tuned.